Welcome to today's webinar, Turning Your Board Leadership into Champions of Your Ministry. Hi, I'm Paul Martin with Advocacy. We're excited about bringing you this topic today. We have a habit of really enjoying board members that we get a chance to work with. I think you'll hear some of the stories today about board leaders who have been remarkable champions of a ministry. Advocacy, we're about building a community of support around a vision, your vision, and let me tell you briefly about Advocacy and your ministry. Advocacy helps grow funding for Christian broadcasters, Christian schools, Bible colleges, missions agencies, frankly any nonprofit organization that carries the gospel. We're very interested in helping you achieve the vision that God has given you. Today we're talking about turning your board leadership into champions of your ministry. And I would like you, as you go along today's meeting or think about it at other times, if your vision for your nonprofit organization is bigger than your budget, please give us a call at Advocacy. Today you'll see our email addresses and our phone numbers on every page that we're working through. You'll see the speakers. In fact, let's introduce those presenters right now. Our first presenter, Randy Bronkema. Randy's background is long experience in development and university advancement as well, working on both the university side as well as Christian schools, radio stations, nonprofits of all sorts. Randy has been able to help get those, get the funding for those ministries to thrive and be able to pursue their vision. I'd like to introduce to you Jerry Grimes, working with radio stations from coast to coast, as large as New York City and frankly I think as small as Fort Wayne, Indiana. Jerry is able to help these nonprofits grow in their income, grow in their leadership, and frankly be able to engage more people for the cause that they have contemplated and taken on as their mission. I would like to introduce to you our newest team member, Will Stevens. Will joins us from Wall Street and Morgan Stanley, and then most recently has completed his Master's of Christian Stewardship at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. Yes, there actually is a degree program for Christian stewardship. We're very happy to have Will here. I think you'll really find his comments practical, insightful, and give rise to the work that you want to do at your ministry. Today, our session will be moderated by Jeff Crabtree. Jeff is our client advocate at Advocacy. He speaks with nonprofit organizations every day and works with large, medium, and small nonprofits to grow income. He's the first one who gets to hear the answer, the concerns, and the questions of nonprofits. And that's why we want to have Jeff speak out of his heart and speak of what he's heard. So without any further ado, Jeff, would you get our call underway?
Thank you very much, Paul. I appreciate it, and welcome everybody. We are certainly very glad that you've joined us today. And I have to admit, I've especially looked forward to this session, partly because it's, while it's one of the more critical, but certainly one of the more sensitive topics that each of us at Advocacy have to deal with. Successful ministry leaders will usually say something like, organizations will rise or fall based upon the level of involvement and certainly the dedication of their board members. Randy, this is really one of your wheelhouses. You know an awful lot about it. You've made an awful lot of incredible sense of progress with different ministries that we've worked with from this area. And I know it's one that you feel very strongly about. Would you please share with those of the folks who are joining us today why strong board leadership is so critical to the success of their ministries?
Well, thank you, Jeff, because I agree with you. I think this is a subject that is so crucial to our ministries and helping our ministries to achieve our mission, to achieve our purpose. So to answer this question, Jeff, we need to define three major responsibilities of a dynamic board. And there are three. Now, certainly there are other things that boards initiate and do. They hire and fire the leader of the organization. They're responsible. They're trustees. But saying all that, there are still just three things that a board must do in order for a ministry to thrive and be successful. The first thing is a dynamic board protects the mission. It protects the mission, the purpose, the why you exist. In other words, that mission has to come down off the wall. We've said that many times in other presentations. It has to come off the wall. So I would encourage you as ministry leaders to put the mission statement on top of the board agenda. Read it together. Talk about it together. And then at the end of your meeting, list that mission statement again and say, how did we move the mission forward? Because their job is to protect that mission. I'd also recommend that you would bring in stories about the mission and how the mission is being accomplished. Bring in individuals that have been touched by your ministry and let them share with the board and be personal with the board, because we need to be embracing this mission. So the first thing is the dynamic board protects the mission. The second thing is a dynamic board embraces the governing values. Now, every organization should have between 5 or 7 governing values. These values should help us in terms of hiring. These values should help us in terms of making decisions. And these values should be a common purpose in which we all live and we all act within the ministry. So the board needs to protect these values, not only protect them, but embrace them and live them as well. And they need to understand these values. And so a dynamic board embraces the governing values and lives by those governing values. The third thing is a dynamic board helps make the vision a reality. In other words, our agendas really should be how we're moving the vision forward. And therefore, how do boards get involved in that vision? Well, by giving their resources, by networking, bringing others to the vision, and public relations, telling the story wherever possible. This is so crucial for board members to do. And Jeff, I got a real quick story for everyone. It was so fun to see this. We were invited to a brand new board member's home for dinner. And by the way, the steak was fabulous. Anyway, we're done with dinner. We're sitting down with in a family room with he and his wife, and he is just so antsy. He's just bouncing around the couch. I mean, just wanting to do something. And finally, the general manager of the organization said, "Is there something you would like to say to us?" And he bounded off his seat, and he literally ran to the general manager and handed him a check. And he said, "We are so excited about your mission. And we are so excited to be a part of this." And guess what? It was a check for $5,017. And it was a check that he gathered from his entire family. And he was so excited to give it to us. I sometimes wonder if we run, Jeff, to give our money. But that's what an excited board member who is passionate about the vision and passionate about what you're doing and realizes that you're trying to do great things for the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Randy, I especially appreciate how you define them early on as a dynamic board member, not just somebody who is participating, but there's really something, that whole dynamism, that power of God behind what they're getting behind. Thanks very much. And by the way, for those of you joining us today, I suspect that as we go through this, Randy, Jerry, and even will be presenting some ideas and concepts that they may put out a little bit faster than you can write them down. So let me just remind you to jot down their phone numbers and email addresses that you can see on the screen there, so that you can contact them after today's session to get answers in greater detail. Jerry, way too many organizations recruit board members, and in some cases they find themselves into a situation where the board is already there when they come on staff, but the board member is left to decide for themselves pretty much what their role is, how he or she is going to serve, and what the boundaries are between what they're doing and the role of the executive running the operations of the ministry. How should our ministry leaders be defining the role of their board?
Well, thanks, Jeff. It's so important, and it reminds me of a story. Just not too long ago, I was in a particular part of the country working with a local nonprofit, and we spent the whole day training, and as we do a lot, we went out to dinner with friends from the organization. But right after we left dinner, I was getting a ride back to the hotel from the president of the ministry, and he confided in me a lot of things that were really troubling him about his board. The issues were mostly ones of micromanagement, where board members wanted to approve expense accounts. They wanted to set office policies and working hours for staff, and lots of minutia. And he was complaining to me about this and saying he really wishes the board was more focused on the big picture and on some of the things that Randy was talking about, their responsibilities. And I really kind of looked at him and I said, did you ever sit down when these board members came together, when they joined the board for the first time, and define their role and lay out for them what their responsibilities were? And there was a lot of silence. Of course, he had not done that, and he took the message, and I think we have a board retreat scheduled real soon to talk about what the responsibilities of the board are. And the point is this: if you don't train board members, don't be at all surprised when they define their role for themselves. And if you want them to stay out of certain territory and really be focused on the big picture, you've got to have a board training process, a retreat, an orientation process, maybe some sort of a binder or a manual that gets the board responsibilities defined. Otherwise, you are just really asking for it. Most boards will not do what this gentleman's board did and have too much control. A lack of definition will actually cause some board members most board members, I should say, to disengage. And you'll end up with a board that just is a do-nothing board that won't participate, and you don't get very much out of them, and you certainly don't get any help in fundraising. If you want them to be engaged, define their role, help them understand what it is they're supposed to do. I would also say that you should offer some training to orient the board. A lot of times, people that you're going to recruit to serve on your board, this will be their very first board experience, and that's okay, because you have the chance to make that a good one, and a chance to make sure you imprint them with the values that you want them to have, and they're not bringing in something in from another organization's culture. Not that experience on other boards isn't good, but you want to offer some training to orient this board. You want them to understand, as Randy said, their key responsibilities as they relate to their mission, your organization's values, and also making sure that they really understand the vision of the organization. And then I think, too, another thing you can do is clearly set expectations for each board member. This can range from a board policy on attendance. Many boards on which I've served have a certain number of meetings a year that you're allowed to miss, and if you miss more than that, the board can actually ask you to recuse yourself from service. Many times these kinds of expectations also, and most importantly really, for the context of development, have to do with board giving policies. Maybe the best policy, I think, is everybody in the board gives to the best of their ability, and everybody in the board makes sure that they're active in the fundraising process. If you have those two policies in place, it solves a lot of problems. But there could be other expectations that you need to set for your board members, and they can go back to some of those guidelines to keep the board driving in the right lane, if you will, and not running into problems. So think about the expectations you want to set and make that part of the orientation process. I would say, too, I agree with what Randy said about board responsibilities, but I also look at it like this. I think as they carry out those responsibilities, they need to be focused on three primary things. And these should be part and parcel of the training and the orientation that they get coming in. That is, supporting the staff and the entire organization in living out the mission. It's one thing to know what the mission statement says and to live and breathe it every day, but the board member needs to see him or herself as responsible for supporting the existing staff and getting the mission done. This will, if you orient board members like this, it will prevent a lot of us against them mentality, because they will see their role as one of support. Doesn't mean they can't question, it doesn't mean that they can't challenge, and even occasionally bring issues up where they feel staff members might need to be corrected or dismissed. But it does mean that they understand their role is, once performing staff members are in place, that they are to be supporting, and they're supposed to help get things done through the staff members. And also, the next one is to drive the organization toward its vision. We know the why, the mission of the organization, but what is the vision? Where are we headed? What are we trying to accomplish? And what is the great goal that God has called us to? It may be a mission, or should be a vision actually, that we're not able to accomplish on this earth. It's going to keep us going forever. But that's okay. It may be a limited vision for the next few years to get us to a particular place as an organization. These are the things that boards can really help in setting these visions and being cheerleaders for the organization, champions to progress things effectively. And in doing 1 and 2 there, supporting the staff and driving the vision, board members need to work in the lane of providing resources and solving problems. They need to see themselves in a supportive role to the staff. They need to see themselves as resource people. When challenges come up before the ministry, the organization's leadership should be able to go to the board and say, these are the challenges we're having. We're having problems with resources, resource development. We're having problems with these issues. These are the challenges we're finding in the environment. And the board, through its experience and wisdom, can be a great resource in solving real-world problems. Jeff, I think those are the things that I think of in terms of defining these board goals.
One follow-up question. Do you find that sometimes the leaders of these organizations feel like, well, yeah, Jerry, but if I started telling them that, they're going to get mad, they're going to leave?
Well, I do think that you can't just walk in and lay down the law to a board that's been in place for a long time. However, I think you can begin to steer the ship 180 degrees in the other direction if necessary by recruiting and training new board members and putting them through an orientation process and having some sort of a retreat where you get the board to understand best practices. And maybe that might involve bringing in somebody on the outside, such as one of us at Advocacy, to try to point out what some of those best practices are.
A question I want to throw up to you, Will, because it's not an exaggeration at all that on a weekly basis, I will be talking with ministries who, when I ask them how involved the board is, they'll say, oh, Jeff, our entire staff, we're extremely passionate about the work that we're doing, and we're excited about the mission that God has given us to fulfill, but my board, they are just not involved. They operate more like an advisory board, perhaps, but they're not, I mean, they don't get involved in what we're doing. What are some practical steps that leaders can follow to get their board to really engage? Can you share a few of those with us?
Sure. So the question is, how do we get board members on board? And specifically, I'd like to talk about how to get a board member involved in fundraising. I'd like to illustrate that with a true story. The simple answer is, how do you get a board member active in fundraising? The simple answer is baby steps. But I want to share that in a story that I call the 5 thank you notes. So we have a real-life ministry here, and they had a board member who it came time at a fundraising campaign. They said, would you help us with fundraising for this campaign? Make a few calls and speak to some donors. And this board member said, excuse me, but I didn't join this board to be a fundraiser. Now, in her defense, this board member was very passionate about the ministry. She was a donor herself, and she was an advocate for the ministry, but she clearly did not see herself taking an active part in any fundraising activity. So time passed, and the next, say, quarterly campaign came up, and one of the staff members suggested, we've got these 5 donors that we don't really know what to do with. They're not major donors. They give a small amount, but they've given a small amount faithfully every year for years and years. They don't respond to our communications, but they're faithful givers. We just don't know what to do with them. They went to Mrs. Board Member and said, would you do us a favor? We don't know what to do with these 5 donors. Would you please sign a thank you note for us? We've written a thank you note, and if you just sign it personally and jot a couple words at the end of the note, I think they might appreciate that. And the reluctant board member said, sure, I'd be happy to do that. Well, they sent out these 5 notes, no big deal. Well, a month or 2 later, there was a fundraising event coming up at the ministry, and the staff member went back to this board member and said, remember those 5 donors that you sent that thank you note to? Well, why don't you send them a personal invite to this event that's coming up? They've never come to an event, and maybe a personal touch might get them on board. So the board member said, sure, I'd be happy to send them a little note. So she writes 5 notes inviting them to this ministry event, And sure enough, 4 of the 5 respond that they're going to attend. Well, they go back to the board member and say, got another little job for you. Well, 4 of those 5 people you invited, you sent that nice note, are coming to this event. Would you be so kind as to meet them and greet them and introduce yourself? I think they'd really appreciate attaching a face to the personal note they got. Well, the board member said, sure, I'd be happy to do that. Well, at the event, it turns out that she spent the entire evening with these 4 donors and forms a relationship with them. So they're jumping in and really having some success here. And ultimately what happens is that these conversations become relationships. And the success that comes out is that they get 2 outsized, perhaps major gifts from these 5 people. And when the news goes back to our board member, she basically says, this is fantastic. I'm so excited that through my small efforts that this ministry was able to generate some stronger donors and some passion and some money. She goes, listen, are there any more donors out there that I could work with? Because this is really rewarding to have these relationships. So through a series of baby steps, we were able to they were able to get a board member who was a reluctant fundraiser, who didn't want to do anything with fundraising, to really become a relationship driver and a great supporter of fundraising, and she really made a difference. So one of the answers to how to get a board member on board is through baby steps in giving the board member small activities and small responsibilities and giving them a sense of participation and a sense of success. So I think that's a great lesson for every ministry when you have a reluctant board member.
Yeah. Will, not only are those a great, terrific outline for, that you can follow to actually move a board member further down the road. It made me think of that old story about the stone soup, where you've got this reticent group who doesn't want to help, and then pretty soon they end up with this great soup because they put everything into it, which is fantastic. Love it. That's a difficult scenario to run into, where you've got to try to get your board member moving more toward what you know they can do. And maybe a little bit more difficult scenario that I hear an awful lot from ministries as I talk to them, not necessarily on a weekly basis, but quite often, is that they will say, well, Jeff, I don't even have a board. Maybe I'm a radio station and I'm owned by a college or a ministry or some foundation, et cetera. And while they're subject to what that institution's main board dictates, they don't really get any of the good interaction with them. The board certainly isn't operating with that station's best interest at heart, because their mindset is focused primarily on what the overriding governing ministry is doing. Jerry, what is a ministry supposed to do when they have that kind of a situation where they say, well, this isn't my board, it's the college's board?
Well, that's exactly the situation I faced when I was a Christian radio station general manager. It was very difficult. We had a very good board at the university that owned the radio station, but they were in charge of running the university and the Bible college and the seminary and the outreach programs of the university, online off-campus degrees and all of that kind of thing. And when it came to the radio station, it was just sort of this extra thing that the school was involved in, and I was expected to report as a couple of times a year, but as long as I kept my nose clean and stayed out of their way, everything was fine. But in terms of getting their buy-in and their support on a regular basis, their leadership and their commitment to the responsibilities and the focus that Randy and I talked about so far, and some of the things that Will talked about in terms of fundraising, it just wasn't there. And so I got permission and sought this out. Actually, I took the problem to the board, and they agreed and said that since many of them, most of them lived out of town, they would appoint one local board member who lived in town, and let me find some of his friends and some of our contacts in the community to serve as an advisory board. So I think forming an advisory board is a perfect solution for a situation like this. They can be made up. It can be made up of people in the community. It can be some of your top donors. I really encourage that. And it can be maybe one or two members of the parent organization's existing local board. That way, you're not going to run too much afoul of what the big board wants you to do. And you got to make sure that when you set this up that you lay down some ground rules for this advisory board. You don't want them to challenge the official board, and they shouldn't see themselves as you know, the fiduciary matters, approving budgets, hiring and firing ministry staff, that kind of thing. They need to see their role as advising on the vision of the organization, leading the organization with the current staff team, and maybe definitely participating in fundraising by bringing new people to the fold who might support the organization. I think advisory boards can be very, very effective. You want to make sure that you set them up so that there's a balance between the real work that you're having them do and the fact that there is another board that really is in control of the organization. But as long as you do that effectively, I think an advisory board can fill the role that you need in terms of leadership and fundraising engagement. And Jeff, I've seen it work a lot
terrific
in lots
advice,
of
and
organizations.
obviously you proved that out. I can actually think of quite a few station managers, some heads of some schools and other ministries who are going to want to put that advice into practice right away. Thank you again, Jerry. Randy, I know you've experienced maybe the best and in some cases the worst board situations that we can imagine, and I know that you've been instrumental in affecting a lot of the changes that move some of these boards maybe more toward that best side of things. Can you wrap up these ideas that we've shared so far and help us to understand how we as leaders can develop directors, heads of our board, as well as board members that really will be effective in that role?
Jeff, I really want to thank you for phrasing it that way, phrasing it in the terms of leaders. Ladies and gentlemen, we're leaders. And what leadership means is influence. Our job is to influence people. Now let me share with you a line that I use in all of my consulting endeavors, that great leaders build great people toward a great vision. The first step in the process is to build great people, and that includes your board. That includes your board. So the first thing is passion. Do they believe with all of their heart the mission? And let me ask you, as the leader of the organization, it needs to start with you. It needs to start with you, because you have to begin to start getting that board to be passionate about that mission. It's got to permeate everything you do. One time I was meeting with a board chair and going through the agenda, and the board chair looked at me and said, "Well, Randy, this is a radical new agenda." And I said, "Mr. Chairman, we do not need the board to help us pick out a copier." And he smiled at me, and he nodded his head, and he said, "You're right. We have to move the mission forward." And number two, do they understand the ministry's history? I think sometimes we fail to give our new board members an orientation of the ministry. What happened in the years past, good or bad, and sharing with them and giving them a genuine view of what the history of this ministry is all about. And do they own the vision? Both Jerry and Will, all of us are saying, do they own the vision? And it needs to be a part of the agenda. Fact is, a ministry's vision needs to be the board's agenda. Very important. And are they willing to make personal commitments? All of us have talked about that. Personal commitments of their time or talents or treasure. Your board needs to be your champion. Whether an advisory board or a main board, they need to be your champions. And there's an action step here I'd like to just share with you real quick, that retreats set the stage for expectations. And this is where I would highly recommend to be a consultant. I've been in fundraising and development for well over 20 years. And as a vice president of advancement, I would go in front of our board and I would make this, what I thought was a very good articulated, inspirational vision of where we needed to go with development. And the board members were almost yawning. Boy, is that discouraging. And then I would hire a consultant. And the consultant would go in front of that board and basically say the same thing that I just said, and he was like E.F. Hutton. Oh boy, we got to do this, we got to do that. And I'm going, I said the same thing, I've been saying it for years. You're never a prophet sometimes in your own home. And so don't be afraid to ask for help that can help you to get that message through to your board and help to move that passion forward. Number 2, participation. Boards need to participate in the work of the ministry. Give them tasks. They are volunteers. They should have tasks in moving the vision forward. They need to witness change lives. Please begin to start bringing those stories to the board. Even bring the people in and let them share those stories, because those stories of changed lives will dramatically affect your board and their passion towards your mission. And then grow spiritually through the service to Christ. Let me ask you, leader, are you growing? Do you have a growth plan? Remember Dr. John Maxwell's 21 laws of leadership, the law of the lid. No one is going to grow any more than you. So if you're not growing, how do you expect your board to grow? And I would challenge your board to grow. When you read a great book, send your board a copy. Encourage them to read it. Maybe even discuss it for 10 minutes before a board meeting. But everybody needs to grow, because if you're not growing, your board and your people are not growing. And thirdly, fundraising. Demonstrate passion by being a champion for this ministry. Are you fundraising? Because fundraising is so much fun. It really is. Helping people to grow in their stewardship. And finally, let me just share this with you. In a retreat that I was leading for a couple of days and in the mountains in a beautiful area, I always like to put in a presentation the ministry's mission statement and then mix it up with a whole bunch of different ministry statements. And I try to quiz them and say, pick out yours. And I'm amazed at how many times they just can't pick it out. And as you begin to start leading them through what are going to be our governing values, and watching them begin to start embracing it, and then developing the mission, and how they begin to start reformulating in their lives, and then slowly begin to start saying, let's paint a picture of what this vision is going to look like in a couple of years. But how it affects them, not only in terms of the ministry, but how it affects them personally and spiritually in their own lives, and how it gives them confidence. Here's what happened with no solicitation from the leader or myself. They got so excited about what the process was doing and the new mission and where they were going that this board solicited, with no prompting from us, a $45,000 start to their share-a-thon. And the general manager was absolutely blown away. You see, the greatness, Jeff, of a board and developing a great board will help you accomplish a great vision.
I love that so much, Randy. You absolutely nailed it with that. And in fact, all three of you, I think the one thing I love is that you not only gave great advice for the leaders of these organizations to get their boards engaged, but the board members themselves who so much want to be actively helping these organizations. This same advice is going to be invaluable to them. Thanks so much. Paul, let me turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you for today's call. I really appreciate all the work that you three have put together in front of boards, and you've been able to share that today to our folks on the call. We're wrapping up here our call today for turning your board leadership into champions of your ministry. Next week we'll be talking about everything you ought to know about your donors. Now that's on February 21st. That'll be noon Eastern, 11 a.m. Central. We look forward to having you join us. All you have to do is go out to advocacy.com, register for the event, and we'll send you the credentials for the meeting. Once again, turning your board leadership into champions of your ministry, you'll see our speakers there on the left today, Will, Jerry, Randy, and Jeff. Please make a note of their phone numbers or their email addresses, and feel free to follow up with questions that maybe you have that we didn't quite get to today. We look forward to hearing your questions and having more conversations with you about your board or maybe about the vision of your ministry.